Imagine a world where the swastika flew over the Kremlin, where the vast expanse of the Soviet Union, home to millions, lay shattered under the heel of Nazi Germany. This was the very real possibility that haunted the world in the tumultuous year of 1941. The year is 1943. The Red Army, battered and broken, has ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. Moscow, the heart of the Soviet beast, has fallen. The seemingly invincible war machine of the Third Reich stands triumphant, the vast resources and manpower of the East now bent to Hitler's will. How did this world, so different from our own, come to pass? What catastrophic miscalculations and strokes of cruel fortune conspired to deliver such a devastating victory to the Nazis? The success of Operation Barbarossa, unthinkable in the context of our timeline, hinged on a number of critical factors. Firstly, the element of surprise, so crucial to the early German blitzkrieg victories in Poland and France, had to be absolute. This meant neutralizing the Soviet Air Force on the ground and decapitating the Red Army's command structure before they could react effectively. Secondly, the Wehrmacht's logistical challenges, often underestimated in accounts of the Eastern Front, had to be overcome. This required not only efficient supply lines stretching across hundreds of miles but also a ruthlessly effective system of resource extraction from captured Soviet territory. The German war machine, heavily reliant on captured equipment and oil, had to become a self-sustaining predator. Politically, a successful Barbarossa demanded a different approach from Hitler. The ideological fanaticism that blinded him to the realities of fighting a war of annihilation against the Soviet people had to be tempered. Cultivating local support, however difficult, would be essential to pacifying conquered territories and releasing manpower for the front lines. Finally, the colossal miscalculation that was the Holocaust had to be avoided. With the Soviet defenses in disarray, and the element of surprise firmly in their grasp, the Wehrmacht achieved a series of stunning victories in the opening months of Operation Barbarossa. Leningrad, starved and bombarded, fell before the winter set in, a testament to the ruthlessness of the German war machine. Moscow, the heart of the Soviet Union, followed in the spring of 1942, effectively decapitating the Soviet command structure. However, it was the fall of the Caucasus, home to the oil fields so vital to the German war effort, that truly sealed the fate of the Soviet Union. The capture of these oil fields, a strategic objective that eluded Hitler in our timeline, crippled the Red Army's ability to wage a mechanized war. Tanks and aircraft, starved of fuel, ground to a halt, leaving the once mighty Red Army at the mercy of the Wehrmacht's mechanized spearheads. This newfound economic strength had profound implications for the global balance of power, emboldening Germany's allies and sending shockwaves through the corridors of power in Washington and London. The fall of Moscow, a symbolic and strategic blow from which Stalin's regime never recovered, ushered in a new and terrifying chapter in the history of the Second World War. The city, once a beacon of hope and defiance, was transformed into a grim symbol of Nazi domination. The Kremlin, the seat of Soviet power, now housed the offices of the German military administration, a stark reminder of the new order that had been imposed. The capture of Moscow, however, did not mark the end of the fighting. Scattered remnants of the Red Army, operating as partisans, continued to resist the German occupation, waging a bitter guerrilla war in the vast hinterlands of the former Soviet Union. The brutality of the fighting, fueled by ideological hatred and the desperation of survival, knew no bounds. The United States, still reeling from the shock of Pearl Harbor, now faced the prospect of a two-front war against an enemy that seemed unstoppable. With the Soviet Union effectively neutralized, Hitler moved swiftly to consolidate his control over Europe. The puppet governments installed by the Nazis were granted a semblance of autonomy, their economies tightly integrated with the German war machine. The dream of a greater Germanic Reich stretching from the Atlantic to the Urals seemed within reach. This new order, as the Nazi propaganda machine termed it, was built on a foundation of racial hierarchy and ruthless exploitation. The peoples of conquered Europe were categorized according to their perceived racial value, with those deemed undesirable facing systematic persecution and extermination. The economies of conquered nations were looted, their industries retooled to serve the German war effort. Traditional power balances were overturned, replaced by a system in which Germany reigned supreme. The seeds of future conflict sown in the ashes of war and occupation were already beginning to sprout. The fall of the Soviet Union presented the Anglo-American alliance with a strategic dilemma of unprecedented proportions. With the Red Army no longer a factor in the European theater, the task of liberating Western Europe from Nazi occupation seemed all but impossible. The vast resources and manpower that the Soviet Union had poured into the Eastern Front were no longer available, leaving the Western Allies facing a seemingly insurmountable challenge. The United States, its industrial might still gearing up for war, was torn between the competing priorities of the Pacific and European theaters. The isolationist sentiment that had hampered American involvement in the war before Pearl Harbor resurfaced, fueled by the daunting prospect of a protracted and costly conflict against a seemingly invincible foe. The Grand Alliance that had triumphed over the Axis powers in our timeline was in danger of unraveling, jeopardizing the very future of the free world. With the fall of the Soviet Union, the Axis powers, emboldened by their triumph, turned their attention to securing their respective spheres of influence. In Asia, Japan, its ambitions unchecked by the threat of Soviet intervention, consolidated its control over its hard-won empire. The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, a thinly veiled euphemism for Japanese hegemony, became a reality. In Europe, the Third Reich, flush with victory and resources, tightened its grip on the continent. The puppet governments of occupied Europe, granted a semblance of autonomy, were little more than tools of the Nazi regime, their economies and resources harnessed to the German war machine. The world, once a tapestry of independent nations, was now increasingly divided between two competing spheres of influence: the Axis powers and their collaborators, and the Anglo-American alliance, isolated and on the defensive. The success of Operation Barbarossa and the subsequent collapse of the Soviet Union cast a long shadow over the world. In the conquered territories of Europe and Asia, a complex and often contradictory mix of resistance and collaboration emerged, shaping the lives of millions caught in the grip of totalitarian regimes. Resistance movements, fueled by a potent mix of patriotism, ideology, and a desperate yearning for freedom, sprang up across the occupied territories. From the French resistance fighters sabotaging German supply lines to the Polish Home Army battling both Nazi and Soviet forces, these groups represented the indomitable spirit of those who refused to bow to tyranny. However, alongside the heroism and sacrifice of the resistance, there was also collaboration. Some individuals, motivated by fear, opportunism, or a misguided belief in the inevitability of German victory, chose to cooperate with the occupiers. The world that might have emerged from the ashes of a successful Operation Barbarossa is a chilling and unsettling prospect. With the Soviet Union destroyed and the Anglo-American alliance on the back foot, the Nazi regime would have been free to consolidate its control over Europe and impose its twisted ideology on the continent. The horrors of the Holocaust, unchecked by the eventual Soviet liberation of the death camps, would have continued unabated, claiming millions more victims. The racial hierarchy at the heart of Nazi ideology would have become the defining feature of life in occupied Europe, condemning entire populations to lives of servitude and persecution. The global balance of power would have been irrevocably altered, with the Axis powers firmly in control of Europe, Asia, and vast swaths of Africa. The hypothetical success of Operation Barbarossa serves as a stark reminder of the fragility of history and the profound consequences of seemingly insignificant events. The world we inhabit today, shaped by the sacrifices and struggles of those who fought against tyranny, could have been very different. The defeat of Nazi Germany and the subsequent emergence of the United States and the Soviet Union as superpowers defined the geopolitical landscape of the latter half of the 20th century. The Cold War, a clash of ideologies and a struggle for global dominance, cast a long shadow over the world, shaping everything from international relations to technological innovation. The question of what might have been had Operation Barbarossa succeeded is a sobering one. a reminder of the importance of vigilance, resilience, and a steadfast commitment to the values of freedom and democracy.